They tell you Africa has no beginning, that it simply appeared, vast, ancient, silent, waiting to be discovered by others. But that lie begins the moment a map is drawn. Because long before borders were inked by foreign hands, before Nigeria, before Egypt, before Ghana had names that fit neatly on paper, Africa already knew itself. It remembered, it planned, it resisted, and it built empires so powerful that the world would later spend centuries trying to forget them. This story does not start with colonization. That would be too easy. It starts earlier, before the world learned to fear Africa's memory. It starts in the dust, the rivers, the gold, and the blood. It starts in whispers passed down by griots, etched into temple walls, buried beneath sandstorms and silence. And what you are about to hear is not the version taught in classrooms. This is the version that survived. Long before Europe learned to navigate the seas, Africa had already mastered time. Along the Nile, people measured years by floods and stars, not kings. In the forests of what would one day be called Nigeria, iron spoke before paper ever could. In the savannas of ancient Ghana, gold did not glitter, it ruled. And yet, these stories were not erased by accident. They were buried deliberately, because power hates competition, and Africa once had too much of it. But here is the first secret they never tell you. Africa was not a single story, it was a conversation between civilizations. Egypt was not isolated. Ghana was not accidental. Nigeria was not late. These places were connected by trade routes, belief systems, technologies, and something far more dangerous to outsiders, self-sufficiency. When you understand this, everything else begins to look different. Take Egypt, for example. You have been taught to imagine it as something separate from Africa, almost floating above the continent like a miracle that happened near Africans but not by them. Yet the Nile does not lie. Its waters flow from deep within Africa, carrying not just silt, but people, ideas, and power northward. Egypt's earliest dynasties did not emerge from nowhere. They rose from African soil, African systems, African gods. And still, that truth makes many uncomfortable. South of Egypt, beyond the desert that later writers would call a barrier, Nubia thrived. Nubians ruled Egypt as pharaohs during the 25th dynasty, wearing crowns of two lands while Europe was still arguing with fire. But this chapter is not about Nubia yet. It is about the pattern, Africa building greatness, the world watching, and history being rewritten when the watching turned into wanting. Now turn westward. Long before the name Ghana described a modern nation, it was a title, Ghana, meaning warrior king. The Ghana Empire did not rely on luck or myth. It controlled gold, and in a world where gold meant power, Ghana meant influence. Arab travelers wrote about it with awe and fear. They described cities where kings sat surrounded by gold, yet lived simply, because wealth was not something to be flaunted, it was something to command. Here is another secret. Africa understood economics before economics had a name. Gold did not leave Ghana freely. Salt did not pass without permission. Trade routes were guarded, taxed, and protected. This was not chaos. This was policy. And for centuries, it worked. The empire grew rich not by conquest alone, but by control. And that terrified the outside world more than any army could. Further south, in the lands that would one day become Nigeria, something equally revolutionary was happening. While others measured progress by monuments, these societies measured it by mastery. The Nok people worked iron before Rome existed. The Yoruba built cities with plan streets while medieval Europe drowned in mud. Benin cast bronze heads so precise that European visitors would later accuse Africans of stealing the technique from them, because they could not accept that such skill could be indigenous. But here's the twist no one expects. These civilizations did not see themselves as great. They saw themselves as normal. Order, spirituality, governance, trade, these were not miracles. They were responsibilities. Kings were not gods. They were caretakers. Power was not absolute. It was accountable. And this worldview would later clash violently with foreign ambitions that believed power was something to be taken, not stewarded. Africa's belief systems reflected this balance. Gods were not distant tyrants. Ancestors were present. The spiritual and physical worlds overlapped, informing law, medicine, and leadership. In Egypt, Ma'at, truth, balance, order, was not just a concept, it was law. In West Africa, the ancestors watched closely. Leadership without morality was not leadership, it was danger. And that is why Africa could not be conquered quickly. Not because of weapons, but because of worldview. You cannot easily dominate people who do not believe you are superior simply because you arrive with louder noise. You cannot erase systems that already work. So instead, history was edited. Stories were simplified. Achievements were detached from their origins. Africa was reframed not as a source, but as a recipient. Yet the land remembered. Rivers remember footsteps. Sand remembers bones. Songs remember names even when books refuse to write them. And across Nigeria, Egypt, Ghana, and beyond, memory survived in oral tradition, ritual, and resistance. Even when empires fell, the knowledge did not die. It adapted. It waited. It hid in plain sight. This chapter is only the door. Because what happens next is not just the rise of empires, but the moment the world realized Africa was never meant to be underestimated. And once that realization took hold, the course of history shifted violently. If you want to understand Egypt, you must first stop looking at the pyramids. Stone distracts the curious. The real story flows quietly, endlessly, without applause. It is brown, alive, and older than memory itself. The Nile was not just a river. It was a calendar, a highway, a lifeline, and a weapon. And long before Egypt became a name spoken with reverence, the Nile had already decided who would rise and who would disappear. Every year, without fail, the river flooded. Not violently, but deliberately. It spilled into the land, depositing dark, fertile soil the Egyptians called Kemet, the Black Land. This was not coincidence. This was rhythm. And those who learned to read that rhythm gained power over time itself. Crops grew where there should have been desert. Life emerged where death was expected. And from that miracle, the first Egyptian civilizations were born, not from conquest, but from cooperation with nature. Here is the first uncomfortable truth. Egypt was African before it was imperial. Its earliest people were dark-skinned, river-bound Africans whose gods looked like them, whose rituals reflected the land they lived on, and whose worldview was deeply tied to balance, not domination. The Nile did not flow from Europe. It did not rise from Asia. It came from deep inside Africa, carrying with it culture, belief, and people who would shape what the world later called civilization. Before pharaohs wore crowns, leaders were chosen because they understood Marat, the sacred law of balance, truth, justice, and harmony. This was not a slogan. It was survival. A ruler who disrupted Marat risked famine, revolt, and divine punishment. Power was conditional. Leadership was sacred service. And that idea, so dangerous to absolute rulers, would later be erased from popular memory. As villages grew into cities, Egypt did not isolate itself. Trade routes stretched south into Nubia and beyond, west into the Sahara when it was still green, and east toward the Red Sea. Gold, ivory, incense, cattle, and ideas moved freely. Egypt was not a miracle floating alone in the desert. It was the northern crown of a vast African network. And Nubia, rich, powerful, disciplined, was not Egypt's shadow. It was its rival, its partner, and at times, its ruler. This is where history starts to get rewritten. When Egyptian dynasties weakened, Nubian kings marched north, not as invaders, but as restorers. The Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty ruled Egypt openly, proudly, unapologetically African. They revived old traditions, rebuilt temples, and ruled according to Marat when Egypt itself had forgotten it. Yet later historians would minimize this period, calling it an interruption instead of what it was, Africa reclaiming its own legacy. The pyramids, too, are misunderstood. They were not built by slaves whipped into submission by tyrants. Archaeology tells a different story. Skilled, laborious, organized teams, paid in food and respect, building monuments not just to kings, but to continuity. These structures were not symbols of ego. They were statements of belief, that life continued beyond death, that ancestors mattered, that memory was eternal. And memory, ironically, became Egypt's greatest threat. Because as centuries passed, foreign powers arrived, Persians, Greeks, Romans, each claiming Egypt, each reshaping its image. They admired its knowledge but feared its origins. So they separated the achievement from the people. Egypt became Mediterranean. Its African roots were blurred. Its gods were renamed. Its philosophies were borrowed without credit. What was once African wisdom became classical thought somewhere else. Yet the Nile never changed its course. Even as empires fell, Egypt's knowledge survived, in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, architecture. Greek scholars studied in Egyptian temples. Roman engineers copied African techniques. And still, Africa was written out of its own story. This was not ignorance. It was strategy. Because admitting Africa as a source meant admitting Africa as equal, or worse, as superior. But Egypt was only one pillar. While the Nile flowed north, another force was rising in the west, quietly, patiently, far from the marble columns and foreign scribes. And unlike Egypt, this power did not build in stone. It built in gold. And gold has a way of rewriting history. Before banks existed, before coins carried faces of dead rulers, before Europe understood the weight of wealth, gold already had a throne in Africa. It did not sit in vaults. It did not sleep behind walls. It moved, quietly, deliberately, across the savannas of West Africa, and wherever it passed, empires rose. This was not luck. This was design. And at the center of it all stood an empire the world would later pretend was a myth, ancient Ghana. But Ghana was never just a place. It was a title. Ghana meant warrior king, and that title carried authority heavier than any crown. The people called their land Ouagadougou, but outsiders knew it by the power it projected. To Arab traders crossing the Sahara, Ghana was not exotic, it was intimidating. They wrote of it with awe and restraint, careful not to offend a system that could end their fortunes with a single decision. Here is the truth fewer told. Ghana did not mine gold the way others did. The people who extracted gold were often forbidden from trading it directly. Why? Because control mattered more than possession. The king owned all nuggets. Dust could circulate. Nuggets could not. This single rule stabilized prices, controlled supply, and ensured that no foreign trader could ever dominate the market. Centuries before modern economics, Ghana had already mastered regulation. And regulation created power. Caravans arrived carrying salt, life itself in the Sahel, textiles, horses, and ideas. They left lighter, poorer, and dependent. Taxes were paid on entry. Taxes were paid on exit. No trade passed without permission. No wealth moved without oversight. Ghana did not beg for relevance. The world came to it. Its capital, Kumba was unlike anything outsiders expected. It was not one city, but two, one for the king and his court, another for merchants and foreigners. Separation was intentional. Influence was monitored. Religion was tolerated but not allowed to dominate. Islam entered peacefully through trade, but traditional beliefs remained powerful, grounding leadership in ancestral law rather than foreign scripture. And that balance, between openness and control, was Ghana's strength. The king ruled surrounded by ceremony, dogs adorned with gold collars, officials dressed in fine cloth, drums announcing authority long before a voice was heard. But behind the spectacle was discipline. Armies were organized. Succession was structured. Justice was enforced. This was not excess. This was stability made visible. Yet prosperity has a way of attracting predators. As Ghana grew richer, attention sharpened. North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually Europe began to understand a dangerous truth. Africa was not poor, it was selective. And what Africa chose not to share became more valuable than what it did. The Sahara, once a protective barrier, became a highway. Trade increased. So did tension. Then came pressure disguised as faith. By the 11th century, the Almoravids, a militant Islamic movement, rose in North Africa. They did not simply want trade. They wanted control. Ghana's tolerance became its vulnerability. Religious justification wrapped around economic ambition, and war followed. Cities were attacked. Trade routes destabilized. The empire weakened, not because it lacked gold, but because it was forced into conflict it never sought. This is another secret rarely spoken. Ghana did not fall overnight. It fractured slowly. Trade shifted. Power decentralized. New states emerged from its shadow: Takru, Mali, Songhai. Ghana's fall was not an end. It was a transfer. Africa did not lose wealth. It redistributed it. And that redistribution would soon produce a ruler whose name would echo across the world. But before Mali rises, we must understand something crucial. Ghana proved Africa could control global systems without conquering continents. It ruled through leverage, not expansion. And that terrified outsiders more than open warfare ever could. Because a system that works does not need permission to exist. The idea that Africa was waiting for civilization collapses here. Ghana did not wait. It dictated. It negotiated. It denied. And when challenged, it resisted, not blindly, but strategically. Still, history remembers conquerors more easily than controllers. So Ghana was minimized, reduced to footnotes, rebranded as early or primitive, as if complexity only counts when written in Latin or Greek. Yet the wealth that later fueled European kingdoms passed first through African hands. Gold remembers where it came from. History rarely knows what to do with men who do not fit its limits. When power exceeds imagination, it becomes uncomfortable. And when that power belongs to Africa, it becomes inconvenient. So names are softened, achievements are minimized, and the truth is carefully trimmed until it no longer threatens anyone. But some stories resist shrinking. Mansa Musa is one of them. By the early 14th century, the Mali Empire had risen from the embers of ancient Ghana like a deliberate correction. This was not a sudden miracle. It was the result of systems inherited, improved, and fiercely protected. Mali understood trade because Ghana had taught it. It understood authority because West Africa had perfected it. What Mali added was scale, and at its center stood a ruler whose wealth would expose the world's deepest insecurities. Mansa Musa did not announce himself with conquest. He inherited an empire already powerful, already wealthy, already respected. Gold flowed from Bambuk and Bua. Salt crossed the desert in caravans so long they looked like moving cities. Mali sat at the crossroads of global trade, linking sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, the Middle East, and beyond. But Musa did something no one expected. He traveled. In 1324, Mansa Musa set out on pilgrimage to Mecca. This was not unusual for a Muslim ruler. What was unusual was how he traveled. 60,000 people accompanied him. 12,000 were enslaved attendants dressed in silk. 80 camels carried gold. So much gold that historians still argue about the numbers because they strain credibility. But the impact cannot be argued. Wherever Musa went, he gave. He gave to the poor. He gave to rulers. He gave to scholars. He gave to cities. Gold flowed so freely that prices collapsed. Entire economies inflated. Cairo suffered for years after his visit. This was not a metaphor. This was monetary disruption on a continental scale. One African king had destabilized global markets simply by being generous. And that terrified the world. Because wealth that moves without permission challenges systems built on control. Musa did not ask Europe for validation. He did not borrow power. He carried it with him, visibly, undeniably. European mapmakers, forced to acknowledge this reality, began drawing him, seated on a throne, holding a gold nugget, crowned and commanding. For a brief moment, Africa could not be ignored. But attention is never neutral. When Musa returned to Mali, he did not retreat into indulgence. He invested. Mosques were built. Universities rose. Timbuktu transformed into a center of learning where law, astronomy, medicine, and theology were studied in libraries that rivaled any in the world. Scholars traveled from Cairo and Andalusia to study there. Books became currency. Knowledge became capital. Here is a secret rarely emphasized. Mali valued education as much as gold. Wealth without wisdom was considered dangerous. Rulers were expected to listen to scholars. Law was debated. Governance was documented. This was not chaos. This was bureaucracy, refined and functional. Yet even this would later be erased. As Europe entered its own period of expansion, Africa's intellectual centers became inconvenient truths. Timbuktu, once celebrated, was later described as mythical or exaggerated. Libraries were looted, burned, or forgotten. When explorers finally arrived centuries later, they were shocked to find that Africans had written histories of their own, because they had been taught Africans could not write. But power always leaves traces. Mali's influence spread through language, law, and lineage. Even as the empire weakened after Musa's death, its structures endured. Songhai would inherit its mantle. Hausa city-states would refine trade. Nigeria's future kingdoms would absorb its lessons. Africa did not lose momentum. It shifted. Yet with each shift, outside interest intensified. Gold was no longer enough. Control of people, land, and narrative became the new objective. Trade turned predatory. Exploration became extraction. And slowly, subtly, the language changed. Africa was no longer rich. It became undeveloped. No longer powerful. Merely potential. That lie would take centuries to fully harden. But before the storm of conquest arrives, there is one more region whose story must be told, not of gold, but of mastery, of cities built without foreign architects, of art so advanced it confused its discoverers, of systems so organized they embarrassed those who claimed superiority. We must now turn southward, to the lands that would one day be called Nigeria, because what happened there would challenge everything the world thought it knew about Africa. When Europeans first arrived on the coast of what would later be called Nigeria, they were not prepared for what they saw, not because it was chaotic, but because it was organized. Too organized. The problem was never that Africa lacked cities. The problem was that these cities contradicted everything Europe needed to believe to justify what came next. Deep inland, beyond the mangroves and rivers, urban life had already mastered itself. Long before colonial borders sliced the land into artificial shapes, the Yoruba had built cities that breathed planning. Ife was not a village that accidentally grew large. It was designed. Roads radiated outward with intention. Neighborhoods were structured by guilds and lineages. Markets operated on fixed days. Leadership was layered: kings, councils, elders, each with defined limits. Power here was not absolute. It was negotiated. And then there was the art. When Europeans eventually uncovered the bronze and terracotta heads of Ife, they froze. These were not crude carvings. These were anatomically precise, emotionally restrained, technically flawless works of realism. The kind of realism Europe itself would not master until centuries later. So instead of rewriting their assumptions, they rewrote the story. They claimed the art must have been made by outsiders: Greeks, Arabs, lost Europeans, anyone but Africans, because admitting the truth would collapse the myth. Further west, Benin rose, not the modern country, but the kingdom whose capital was so carefully planned that a Portuguese visitor compared it to Amsterdam. Wide streets, straight avenues, massive earthworks stretching thousands of kilometers, larger than the Great Wall of China in scale. Benin City was clean, regulated, and governed by a sophisticated bureaucracy under the Oba, whose authority was both sacred and constitutional. Here is a quiet truth: Benin did not need Europe. When trade began, it was on Benin's terms. Pepper, ivory, textiles, art, exchanged carefully, deliberately. Benin restricted what could be sold. It controlled its image. It protected its institutions. And for a time, it worked. The kingdom understood something crucial: access is power. In the north, the Hausa city-states thrived: Kano, Katsina, Zaria, each a hub of trade, learning, and diplomacy. Islamic scholarship blended with indigenous governance. Law courts functioned. Written records were kept. Trade connected them to North Africa and the Middle East. No kings, no thrones, no centralized rulers. Power flowed upward from the people. Councils, age grades, title societies, decision by consensus, leadership by merit. This was democracy in practice long before the word existed. It confused outsiders. How do you conquer a people who have no king to overthrow? You divide them. That answer would come later. What connected all these societies was not sameness, but sophistication. Each solved the problem of governance in its own way. Each adapted to environment, belief, and need. There was no single African model, because Africa was never a single idea. And that plurality was dangerous. Imagine a time long before the world knew it as Nigeria. A time of sprawling cities, intricate art, and complex systems of governance. This wasn't a primitive land waiting for discovery. This was a region buzzing with empires, kingdoms, and city-states, each with a story richer and more advanced than most history books would have you believe. Forget the tired, simplistic narratives. Today, we are pulling back the curtain to reveal the magnificent, often hidden, history of pre-colonial Nigeria. For centuries, this land was a tapestry woven from countless cultures. In the north, the Hausa city-states like Kano and Katsina were bustling hubs of the trans-Saharan trade, their walls protecting vibrant markets where goods and ideas from across Africa and the Middle East converged. Their administrative systems were sophisticated, their crafts legendary. To the southwest, the Yoruba people established powerful kingdoms. The city of Ife, considered the spiritual heartland, produced breathtaking bronze and terracotta sculptures with a realism that rivaled the masters of the European Renaissance. Nearby, The Oyo Empire built its power on a formidable cavalry and a complex system of political checks and balances, with the Alafin, the king, governing alongside a council of chiefs known as the Oyo Messi. And then there was Benin, not the modern-day country, but the ancient kingdom in what is now southern Nigeria. The Kingdom of Benin was a marvel of urban planning and artistic achievement. When the first Portuguese sailors arrived in the late 15th century, they were stunned. They described a vast city, protected by massive earthen walls and moats, with a great palace adorned with thousands of intricate bronze plaques. These weren't just decorations, they were a library in metal, recording the kingdom's history, its royal lineage, and its spiritual beliefs. The artisans of Benin were masters of the lost wax casting technique, creating works of such detail and beauty that for years, many Europeans refused to believe they were of African origin. Further east, the Igbo people developed a unique and highly decentralized society. Instead of centralized monarchies, they lived in a confederation of autonomous villages and towns, governed by councils of elders and title holders. This system, often described as a form of republicanism, fostered a deep sense of community, individual achievement, and democratic principles. Their trade networks were extensive, their philosophical systems profound, and their cultural traditions deeply ingrained. From the Kanem-Bornu Empire in the northeast, a major Islamic and intellectual center for over 1,000 years, to the coastal communities of the Niger Delta, this land was a mosaic of advanced societies. They had their own systems of law, medicine, education, and finance. They traded, they warred, they created alliances, and they built civilizations that stood for centuries. So, why is so much of this incredible history unknown to the wider world, and even to many Nigerians today? The answer is a painful one, and it begins with a catastrophic shift in global history, the transatlantic slave trade. What started as limited trade with Europeans morphed into a monstrous enterprise that would tear the very fabric of these societies apart. The demand for enslaved labor on plantations in the Americas fueled centuries of conflict, instability, and unimaginable human suffering. The trade wasn't a simple transaction, it was a brutal engine of destruction. It pitted kingdoms against each other, turning neighbors into enemies. The constant raids and warfare decimated populations, destroyed economies, and bred an atmosphere of fear and mistrust that lingered for generations. Millions of the strongest, healthiest, and most skilled individuals, farmers, artisans, scholars, and leaders, were stolen from their homes. Imagine the loss. It wasn't just a loss of people, it was a loss of knowledge, of culture, of potential. It was a brain drain on a continental scale, leaving a void that would be ruthlessly exploited. This era of devastation paved the way for the next chapter of erasure, formal colonization. In the late 19th century, at the Berlin Conference, European powers carved up Africa amongst themselves without any regard for the existing political, ethnic, or cultural boundaries. Britain, citing the need to end the slave trade it had profited from for so long, began its military conquest of the region. The campaign was bloody and relentless. In 1897, a British punitive expedition invaded Benin City. They burned it to the ground and looted its treasures. Thousands of those priceless bronze plaques and ivory carvings were stolen and shipped off to museums and private collections in Europe, where many remain to this day. It was an act of cultural vandalism on an epic scale, an attempt to literally erase a kingdom's memory from its own home. The British colonial administration then imposed a new system of governance, one that often ignored or deliberately undermined traditional structures. They rewrote history, portraying pre-colonial Africa as a dark, savage continent in need of European salvation. Colonial education taught a version of history that began with the arrival of Europeans. The glorious achievements of Ife, Oyo, Benin, and the Igbo were downplayed, distorted, or simply ignored. The goal was to create a colonial subject who was disconnected from their own heritage, who saw their past as shameful and their future as dependent on the colonizer. This psychological warfare was perhaps as damaging as the physical conquest. But a story, a culture, a memory, is a resilient thing. It cannot be completely erased. The resistance to this erasure began the moment the oppression started, and it has never stopped. Throughout the slave trade, enslaved Africans carried their cultures, beliefs, and memories with them across the Atlantic. In Brazil, Cuba, Haiti, and the United States, you can still find the enduring legacy of Yoruba, Igbo, and other Nigerian cultures in the religion, music, food, and language of the diaspora. They held on to their identity against all odds, a powerful act of spiritual and cultural resistance. Back home, the fight continued. Elders passed down oral histories from generation to generation, keeping the memory of their ancestors and their great kingdoms alive through stories, proverbs, and ceremonies. These oral traditions became living libraries, preserving the knowledge that colonial textbooks tried to wipe out. In the 20th century, a new generation of Nigerian nationalists, scholars, and artists rose up to reclaim their history. Pioneers like Kenneth Dyke and Ada Jari challenged the colonial narratives, founding new schools of African history told from an African perspective. Writers like Chinua Achebe, with his masterpiece Things Fall Apart, gave the world a powerful, intimate look at the dignity and complexity of Igbo society before the colonial rupture, giving a voice to those who had been silenced. Today, the legacy of these ancient societies is all around. It's in the vibrant art scenes of Lagos and Osogbo. It's in the enduring influence of traditional rulers who still serve as custodians of their people's culture. It's in the proverbs that guide everyday life and the resilience that defines the Nigerian spirit. It's a history of magnificent empires and brilliant artists, of profound philosophies and democratic ideals. But it's also a history of brutal disruption, of systematic erasure, and of the unyielding fight to remember. Understanding this full, complex story is not just about correcting the historical record. It's about restoring dignity, challenging old prejudices, and recognizing that the foundations of modern Nigeria were built not on a vacant land, but on the enduring legacy of ancient and powerful civilizations. Their story is a vital part of our shared human story, and it's one that deserves to be told, remembered, and celebrated. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If you found this story as important as we do, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it so more people can discover this hidden history. Meanwhile, further north, the Hausa city-states displayed another form of resilience. Kano, Katsina, and Zaria thrived through commerce and scholarship. Scholars wrote in Ajami, a script blending Arabic letters with local languages. Trade in salt, leather, and textiles continued despite external pressures. Warfare was strategic. Alliances were diplomatic. These cities functioned as nodes in a sophisticated continental system, a system Europe struggled to map because it did not align with its assumptions. And then there was the Igbo of southeastern Nigeria. Unlike Oyo or Benin, the Igbo did not have a centralized king. Power flowed through councils of elders and age-grade systems. Communities made decisions collectively. Leaders were accountable, removable, and bound by law. When Europeans attempted to subjugate them, they found chaos, but only because they misunderstood the system. Igbo society was not disorganized. It was intentionally decentralized, resilient, and adaptive. Across these regions, another thread connected them all: knowledge of geography, trade, and survival. Rivers, forests, and mountains were mapped in memory long before European surveyors arrived. Seasonal cycles dictated movement, planting, and raiding strategies. Communication networks were precise: drums, messengers, smoke signals. Africa's landscapes were not empty spaces to conquer. They were intricate ecosystems that humans had mastered. And mastery bred secrecy. Communities concealed routes, safeguarded knowledge, and moved populations when necessary. European armies could not rely on intelligence. Maps were misleading. Local populations could disappear into forests or deserts for years. When invasions failed, Africa adapted and rebuilt, often faster than Europe realized. Yet the greatest resilience was cultural. Music, oral histories, religious practices, and ritual carried memory across generations. Even when cities were looted or leaders killed, knowledge persisted. Children learned not only survival but identity. Stories of kings, heroes, and empires were encoded in songs, masquerades, and lineage histories. No foreign power could erase what people remembered collectively. This persistence created another secret. Africa's continuity was invisible to outsiders. From the coast, Europe saw fragmented kingdoms and intermittent wars. What they did not see was the depth of networks connecting the continent: trade, marriage, alliances, and shared knowledge. Africa was not waiting to be discovered. It was thriving in ways that defied European expectations. And in every corner, resistance was pragmatic. Armies fought when necessary, retreated when wise, and preserved culture above all. Cities rebuilt. Traditions endured. Education persisted. Religion adapted. Language evolved. Africa's empires were like water. They took the shape required to survive, yet could not be stopped. But even resilience carries risks. Division and betrayal, sometimes exacerbated by foreign interference, weakened some kingdoms over time. Civil wars erupted. Trade shifted. European powers exploited these fractures, gradually extending their reach. Africa's internal strengths were weaponized against it, but never entirely neutralized. The lesson of this era is clear. Africa never stopped being powerful. It stopped being underestimated at its own peril. Empires that survived invasion, cities that resisted capture, and knowledge systems that endured all served as evidence that the continent's narrative is not one of failure. It is one of calculated, resilient continuity. Africa was never isolated. That is a story you have been told 1,000 times, wrongly. For thousands of years, from the deserts of Egypt to the forests of Nigeria and the savannas of Ghana, Africa's civilizations were central to global networks long before Europe set sail. And yet, much of the world still believes the continent discovered itself only when Europeans arrived. This is false. Africa shaped the world long before anyone else knew how. Take trade. Salt from the Sahara, gold from Mali, kola nuts from the forests, ivory and hides from the savannah. These goods moved across continents with precision and value. Caravans stretched hundreds of miles, guided by traders whose understanding of geography, weather, and diplomacy exceeded that of many European explorers centuries later. Knowledge of markets, exchange, and negotiation existed not in theory but in practice, and it moved faster than armies could. And Africa did not trade alone. Arab, Berber, and later European traders came to Africa not as conquerors at first, but as participants in networks Africa already controlled. Egypt's ports connected Africa to the Mediterranean, and the Indian Ocean trade linked East Africa to Arabia, India, and even China. Cities like Timbuktu, Gao, and Kano were hubs of commerce and scholarship that rivaled any in the world. Africa was not passive. It dictated terms. Here is a truth rarely taught. Africa's intellectual influence spread globally. Mathematics, astronomy, navigation, medicine, and architecture were developed and refined across the continent. Arab scholars traveled to study in Mali. Indian Ocean merchants learned from Swahili city-states. Mediterranean civilizations borrowed techniques from Egypt. African knowledge shaped science and trade long before it was credited in European texts. Religion, too, was a conduit of influence. Islam spread through Africa organically, blending with local customs rather than replacing them. Pilgrimages, like that of Mansa Musa, did more than demonstrate wealth. They spread ideas, scholarship, and influence. Pilgrimages created cultural bridges linking Africa to Mecca, Cairo, and beyond, ensuring that African systems of governance, law, and trade were respected internationally. Even when Europe arrived, Africa's impact was undeniable. Portuguese explorers marveled at Benin's urban planning, Ifa's artistry, and the sophistication of Hausa city-states. European coins and goods flowed into African markets, but African rulers dictated the terms, often profiting far more than the newcomers anticipated. Africa was a teacher, a partner, a negotiator, and sometimes, deliberately, a deceiver when self-preservation demanded it. Consider art. Benin bronzes, Nok sculptures, and Ifa heads were admired, copied, and sometimes stolen, but never credited correctly. Africa's aesthetic sensibilities influenced global art, symbolism, and even architecture. Traders carried motifs from Africa to the Americas and Europe, shaping styles while erasing the source. Culture became both weapon and shield, surviving even as empires were challenged. And here is the twist. Africa's networks extended into the Americas long before mass European colonization. Through trade, migration, and eventually the tragic transatlantic slave trade, African systems, agriculture, religion, culinary knowledge, music, and governance were implanted across continents. Enslaved people carried memory, skill, and culture into the Americas, creating societies that blended African ingenuity with new circumstances. But the world misread this influence as accident. Africa's centrality was portrayed as passive rather than active. Knowledge was presented as borrowed, art as primitive, commerce as opportunistic. Yet the truth was clear. Africa's societies were architects of a global system, not mere participants. Europe's later power relied heavily on the foundation Africa had already laid. Still, Africa faced a paradox. Its influence was vast, yet its autonomy was under threat. Global attention had consequences. The same networks that enabled wealth and intellectual exchange also facilitated exploitation. Slave traders mapped routes, tracked resources, and manipulated alliances, turning Africa's strengths into vulnerabilities. Yet even in these circumstances, African agency persisted. Communities adapted, resisted, and preserved identity. By the 17th century, the stage was set for the most extreme confrontation between Africa and global forces. Knowledge, wealth, and culture met ambition, greed, and violence. The lessons of Ghana, Mali, Egypt, Benin, and Nigeria converged. Africa could create empires, influence worlds, and survive attempts at erasure, but only by continuously balancing openness with protection. This chapter proves a central fact: Africa shaped the world long before the world shaped Africa. The continent's rivers, deserts, and forests were not boundaries. They were highways of influence. And the lessons carried across oceans are still embedded in societies today. Africa's brilliance had always attracted attention, but the 17th and 18th centuries brought a force the continent had never faced at scale: systematic extraction. Not of resources alone, but of people, ideas, and memory. Empires that once dictated trade, knowledge, and culture now found themselves negotiating survival under a shadow that stretched across oceans. And yet, even under this pressure, Africa's ingenuity refused to bow. The Atlantic slave trade was not simply a crime. It was a machine that exploited Africa's strengths against itself. Empires that had mastered trade networks suddenly became suppliers of human cargo. Kingdoms like Dahomey and Oyo leveraged diplomacy, coercion, and warfare to navigate this grim economy. Some rulers attempted to limit its impact. Others exploited it to strengthen internal authority. In every case, African agency was present, even when the outcomes were tragic. Yet for all the suffering, Africa never became passive. Across the continent, resistance was constant, sophisticated, and multidimensional. Maroon societies in the forests of Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Ghana provided sanctuary. Rebels in Mali and Benin disrupted European trade routes. Coastal communities developed warning systems to alert inland populations of approaching slavers. Survival was strategic, requiring deep knowledge of terrain, networks, and timing. Even under slavery's shadow, culture persisted. Religious practices, oral histories, music, and storytelling became vehicles of memory. Enslaved people carried African languages, agricultural techniques, and governance principles across the Atlantic, creating diaspora communities that preserved identity. This was a form of quiet rebellion. Though the body was captured, the mind, spirit, and history were unbound. Meanwhile, African empires adapted internally. The shadow stretched far, yet it also revealed something extraordinary. African empires were not defined by domination alone, they were defined by continuity. Even when their cities burned, even when populations were displaced, the systems they built endured in secret, in diaspora, and in the resilience of surviving communities. The 19th century arrived like a storm. European powers, industrialized and armed with guns, steamships, and colonial ambition, began carving Africa into territories on paper long before their flags flew. When British forces attempted the infamous 1897 invasion, they were confronted with resistance both visible, archers, warriors, fortified positions, and invisible, knowledge of terrain, ambush points, and evacuation strategies that ensured culture and memory survived even when cities were partially destroyed. Further north, the Sokoto Caliphate had created one of the most advanced Islamic states in history. Governance was efficient, based on law and scholarship, with a bureaucracy that rivaled European counterparts. When colonial powers arrived, they faced not a single ruler to conquer, but a network of administrators, scholars, and military leaders who understood diplomacy, negotiation, and resistance. Every European advance required negotiation, bribes, or betrayal of local trust, highlighting the complexity of African authority. The Yoruba city-states also demonstrated adaptability. Oyo, once famed for its cavalry and political councils, used a combination of military strength and strategic relocation of populations to protect critical assets. Communities were not passive victims. They participated in defense, intelligence gathering, and diplomacy. Knowledge of local terrain and social networks allowed empires to absorb initial blows and continue functioning. Meanwhile, cultural preservation became an act of rebellion. Festivals, masquerades, and oral histories encoded resistance, identity, and law. Even when physical structures were destroyed, memory persisted. Artifacts were hidden, songs preserved history, and oral narratives ensured that even generations born under colonial rule remained connected to ancestral knowledge. Africa's survival depended not on brute force alone, but on the invisible resilience of culture and identity. The scramble for Africa also exposed a critical paradox. Technological superiority does not equal understanding. European armies could destroy cities, but they could not erase lineage, memory, or belief. African societies used this to their advantage. Knowledge of local rivers, forests, and mountains enabled strategic retreats and ambushes. European soldiers often found themselves disoriented, unable to navigate terrains that Africans had mastered for centuries. Coastal access was increasingly controlled by Europeans, but inland routes, river transport, and inter-kingdom commerce continued. Africa remained economically active, adapting goods, strategies, and markets to maintain autonomy. Gold, kola nuts, salt, and textiles continued to circulate, often under local control, revealing an enduring capacity to thrive under pressure. Education persisted against odds. Quranic schools in the north, secret societies in the east, and apprenticeship systems in the south ensured that knowledge survived. Literacy, mathematics, astronomy, and governance were transmitted covertly when necessary, laying the groundwork for a resurgence of African intellectual life in the 20th century. Perhaps the greatest lesson of this era is subtle yet profound. African resistance was not always dramatic warfare. It was adaptation, negotiation, and continuity under pressure. Cities, empires, and knowledge systems were not destroyed. They evolved, dispersed, and survived. The continent endured because it understood that survival required both action and patience, both visibility and secrecy. By the century's end, Africa was not free from foreign domination, but it remained intellectually, culturally, and socially unbroken. Empires had been weakened, yes, but they had left an indelible legacy of governance, trade, scholarship, and resilience. And the seeds planted in millennia prior, memory, ingenuity, and identity, would one day blossom into new movements, new nations, and renewed assertion of Africa's central role in global history. Africa's story is often told in fragments, as if brilliance emerged only sporadically. But the truth is more profound. For millennia, African civilizations were laboratories of innovation that influenced not just the continent, but the globe. From governance to mathematics, agriculture to architecture, Africa's contributions laid foundations that would ripple far beyond its borders. And yet, much of this influence remains hidden, quietly embedded in systems the world often assumes are European in origin. Consider mathematics. Long before Europe developed formalized systems, Africans were calculating, measuring, and engineering with precision. Applied arithmetic to taxation and commerce. Systems like these were not merely practical. They were intellectual feats rivaling those of any contemporary civilization. Agriculture provides another example. Africans domesticated, cultivated, and selectively bred countless crops. Yams, millet, sorghum, and kola nuts thrived under careful management. Irrigation systems in Egypt, terraces in the Ethiopian highlands, and rice cultivation in West Africa reveal a mastery of land and environment that shaped diets, economies, and global trade. When Europeans later exploited African crops or transposed them to the Americas, they were building on knowledge Africa had refined for centuries. Architecture and urban planning also reveal Africa's ingenuity. The cities of Ife, Benin, and Kano were not random assemblages of mud and timber. Streets were planned, neighborhoods organized, and public spaces maintained with administrative precision. Even in monumental construction, like pyramids, ziggurats, and palace complexes, Africans developed techniques that ensured durability, functionality, and cultural significance. European visitors often assumed they were borrowing from outside sources, but in reality, these innovations were indigenous, precise, and centuries ahead of their time. Science and medicine further illustrate Africa's intellectual depth. Egyptian physicians performed surgeries, set broken bones, and developed pharmacology. West African societies identified medicinal plants, devised treatments, and maintained medical knowledge through apprenticeships and oral traditions. Knowledge was practical, systematic, and passed across generations, ensuring both survival and societal stability. Even navigation and geography reveal African mastery. The Nile, Niger, and Congo rivers were highways connecting cities, empires, and trade networks. Indigenous techniques for understanding currents, seasonal patterns, and desert routes enabled commerce and military strategy. Across the continent, knowledge of terrain was embedded in memory, song, and ritual, allowing empires to thrive in landscapes that outsiders often misjudged as wild or empty. Art and symbolism were also forms of sophisticated innovation. Benin bronzes, Ife terracottas, and Nok sculptures employed metallurgy, casting, and proportion in ways that confused European observers. African artisans encoded history, lineage, and spirituality into their work, creating multi-layered cultural archives that survive centuries of plunder. These works were not decorative. They were both educational and political tools. And then there is governance. Africa developed systems of accountability, law, and leadership that rivaled Europe's. Centralized kingdoms like Mali and Oyo employed bureaucracies, councils, and checks on authority. Stateless societies like the Igbo practiced democracy through councils, age grades, and consensus. Leadership was strategic, adaptive, and culturally embedded, an innovation in human organization itself. Trade and economics were equally advanced. West African empires managed wealth with regulation, taxation, and currency control long before modern economic theory existed. Markets were structured, supply chains monitored, and foreign interactions carefully balanced. Africa shaped global commerce before global commerce existed as a concept. Yet much of this knowledge was misattributed, stolen, or hidden. The brilliance of African innovation became invisible in historical narratives because European powers often profited from it without acknowledgement. When African crops fed the Americas, when African techniques influenced architecture, or when African gold underpinned early European economies, credit was erased, but the impact endured. This hidden influence has a lesson. Africa never needed validation to create genius, and it never stopped shaping the world even under oppression. Its innovations were adaptive, resilient, and invisible because survival often required secrecy. Knowledge, once discovered, cannot be unlearned. And Africa's intellectual legacy, embedded in technology, agriculture, art, and governance, remains woven into the fabric of modern civilization. The Atlantic is often described as a void, a crossing where lives were lost and cultures erased. But for Africa, it became a conduit. Knowledge, faith, skill, and memory traveled with enslaved Africans, shaping societies far beyond the continent. What was intended as destruction became a vehicle for survival, adaptation, and quiet revolution. Enslaved Africans carried with them more than labor. They carried knowledge. They knew agriculture, irrigation, and crop rotation. They understood livestock management and environmental adaptation. In the Americas, they applied this knowledge to sugar, rice, and cotton plantations. African expertise turned marginal lands into productive economies, yet history rarely credits them for it. Rice cultivation in South Carolina and Georgia, for instance, relied heavily on African techniques imported from West Africa. The crops, the methods, the timing, all African. Language and oral traditions also survived the crossing. African words entered creoles, dialects, and spiritual expressions. Music carried rhythms, scales, and storytelling conventions. Drums, songs, and chants became codes of communication, resistance, and memory. Enslaved communities maintained collective identity through ritual, storytelling, and spiritual practice, ensuring that even in captivity, African culture persisted. Religion adapted and endured. In the Americas and the Caribbean, African spiritual practices merged with Christianity to create syncretic faiths, Vodun, Santeria, Candomblé, and others. Ancestors remained central to belief. Rituals encoded social rules, survival strategies, and historical memory. Even when European missionaries attempted to impose religion, African systems persisted beneath the surface, transforming rather than disappearing. Skill and artistry traveled too. Africans brought metalworking, pottery, weaving, and basketry. They built houses, tools, and boats using methods honed for centuries in Africa. Enslaved communities innovated continuously, applying these skills to new environments. Even cuisine, medicine, and herbal knowledge bore African fingerprints, subtly transforming entire regions. But the most remarkable legacy was social organization. Africans retained systems of kinship, governance, and community even under the constraints of slavery. Elders mediated disputes, women maintained networks, and collective memory guided survival. These social structures allowed communities to endure, resist, and ultimately influence the societies around them. And resistance was constant. Maroon communities in Jamaica, Suriname, Brazil, and the US established autonomous settlements. These were not mere refuges. They were political, economic, and cultural centers, replicating elements of African governance, trade, and ritual. They preserved knowledge that Europe assumed had been destroyed. Even art and storytelling became tools of memory and defiance. Quilts, songs, dance, and masks encoded history, genealogy, and lore. Every story told, every drumbeat struck, and every pattern sewn was a way to transmit identity across generations. The Atlantic could separate bodies, but it could not erase culture. Economically, African skills shaped production. Plantations, towns, and industries relied on African knowledge of land, tools, and labor management. Even after slavery ended, these contributions persisted, embedding African influence deeply into emerging economies. Yet for centuries, credit was denied and recognition delayed. This diaspora also fueled intellectual movements. Africans in the Americas and Europe carried memory that became the foundation for abolition, civil rights, and cultural revival movements. From Haiti to Harlem, from Brazil to London, African resilience was both spiritual and practical. Memory became a weapon against oppression. The lesson is clear. Africa's influence did not stop at its shores. It survived chains, oceans, and centuries of erasure. Its knowledge, art, faith, and governance adapted, persisted, and transformed the world. What was meant to break Africa instead became a vector for its enduring power. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Africa had endured centuries of extraction, displacement, and foreign domination. Empires had weakened, trade had shifted under colonial control, and centuries of autonomy seemed, to outsiders, erased. But beneath the surface, resilience persisted. Knowledge, culture, and identity survived, waiting for the moment to reassert themselves. This was the dawn of what would later be called the African Renaissance. Education became one of the earliest tools of resurgence. Missionary schools introduced literacy in European languages, but Africans adapted these systems to preserve their history and prepare future leaders. In northern Nigeria, Quranic schools coexisted with colonial education, blending Islamic scholarship with modern learning. In the south, private and community schools emphasized mathematics, trade skills, and leadership. Africans were not passive students. They were architects, shaping education to serve liberation and self-determination. Trade networks, though disrupted, began to recover in modified forms. Africans leveraged new opportunities in cocoa, palm oil, and textiles to generate wealth independently of direct colonial oversight. Lagos, Accra, and other port cities became hubs of commerce where African entrepreneurs operated, negotiated, and built networks that challenged European monopolies. Wealth, once again, became a tool of influence. Have you ever wondered what happens when a continent decides to remember its own story? This isn't just about politics. It's about a renaissance that reshaped Africa and the world. Long before the 20th century, a powerful awakening was already underway. Intellectuals, artists, and leaders started looking back, not with nostalgia, but for inspiration. The magnificent stories of ancient Mali, Benin, Oyo, and Egypt, once buried by colonial narratives, were being retold in theaters, newspapers, and books. This wasn't just history, it was a cultural revival. Art forms, music, and dance were brought back to life, not as relics, but as bold statements of identity. Language itself became a tool of resistance. Across the continent, local languages thrived alongside European tongues, finding their way into print, schools, and scholarship. This was a quiet revolution, proving that culture could not be erased. At the same time, the seeds of political change were being planted. Secret societies, youth movements, and early political associations began to sprout in Nigeria, Ghana, and beyond. Africans learned to navigate the colonial system strategically, forming councils and unions that challenged oppression from within while preparing for the day they would govern themselves. The fight for independence didn't start with protests in the streets. It began in classrooms, in debates, and in the quiet resolve to reclaim a stolen future. Religion, too, became a source of incredible resilience. While European Christianity spread, it didn't simply replace what was there. Instead, Africans adapted it, blending it with their own traditions to maintain moral structure and authority. In the north, Islamic scholarship continued to flourish, producing brilliant jurists, historians, and philosophers who would later shape modern governance. Faith wasn't a tool of division. It was a bridge connecting a deep-rooted past with an emerging future. Even as cities like Lagos, Ibadan, and Accra grew rapidly, they became unique hubs where tradition and modernity coexisted. Kinship networks and traditional authority thrived alongside bustling commerce and new educational institutions. This was African ingenuity at its best, blending change with identity, ensuring that progress didn't mean erasure. Art and literature became weapons of this revolution. Writers and poets revisited African myths and histories, reclaiming narratives that had been twisted or ignored for centuries. The grand legacies of Mali and Benin were no longer footnotes in someone else's history book. They were beacons of inspiration for a new generation demanding intellectual equality on the world stage. Even science and medicine saw a revival. Africans began integrating traditional knowledge with modern techniques in agriculture, engineering, and healthcare, creating innovations that were uniquely their own. The world was slowly beginning to acknowledge what Africa had always known. Its ingenuity was boundless. But perhaps the most profound shift was in consciousness. Africans began to see themselves not as subjects or victims, but as the proud inheritors of thousands of years of achievement. The stories of their great empires were living proof of their capability, resilience, and power. Identity became the very foundation for liberation. By the mid-20th century, this groundwork had matured into powerful movements ready to redefine the continent. Independence was finally on the horizon, not as a gift from colonial powers, but as the hard-won fulfillment of centuries of survival, adaptation, and strategy. Africa had endured. It had learned. It had preserved. And now, it was ready to rise again. The mid-20th century wasn't just about lowering one flag and raising another. It was a moment of profound reawakening, when centuries of resilience finally burst into political action. Nations that had survived empires and exploitation were now on the cusp of self-determination. But independence was more than a political event. It was the reassertion of identity, a complex negotiation of memory, and the inheritance of millennia of civilization. Nigeria, Ghana, and other new nations became laboratories of governance. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana and Nnamdi Azikiwe in Nigeria knew the power of history. They saw independence not as a break from the past, but as a reclaiming of the authority their ancestors had wielded for centuries. They knew governance was an African tradition, not a borrowed concept. The first major test was the economy. These new nations inherited economies designed for colonial extraction, often dependent on a single resource. But leaders and entrepreneurs drew on historical knowledge of trade networks and markets to diversify. Cocoa, palm oil, and minerals became symbols of agency, proof that Africa could shape its own economic destiny. Cultural revival reached a fever pitch. After centuries of attempted erasure, African languages, art, and music were revalorized. Scholars documented oral histories that had been passed down for generations. Artists drew inspiration from Benin bronzes and Ifa heads. Education was redesigned to place African identity at its core. Memory was no longer a private affair. It was central to building a nation. But this legacy was also heavy. The artificial borders drawn by colonizers had forced diverse peoples into single nations, creating internal tensions. Leaders faced the monumental task of unifying centuries of distinct histories into a cohesive modern state. It required a level of diplomacy and innovation few other nations have ever had to muster. Religion played a crucial role in stabilizing these new societies. Islam, Christianity, and indigenous beliefs coexisted, shaping laws, education, and social norms. This fusion of faith and governance showcased Africa's age-old ability to adapt and integrate diverse systems. Science and technology also expanded rapidly. African universities, building on pre-colonial intellectual traditions, began training their own engineers, doctors, and scientists. They blended traditional knowledge with modern methods, creating hybrid solutions uniquely suited to the continent's needs. From agriculture to medicine, knowledge became a powerful instrument of progress. The spirit of resistance and innovation continued, but in new forms. Civil society, political movements, and a free press allowed citizens to participate in shaping their own futures. The lessons of past empires, accountability, strategic alliances, negotiation, were now being applied to modern nationhood. However, independence also brought new challenges. Global pressures, Cold War politics, and economic dependency tested the resilience of these young nations. The ancient wisdom of adaptation and strategic thinking became more essential than ever. Leaders who understood their history were better equipped to navigate these turbulent waters. Education remained the cornerstone of this new era. Schools taught African history alongside world history, ensuring that future generations understood their powerful inheritance. This wasn't just nostalgia, it was strategic empowerment. Ultimately, independence was both a triumph and a profound responsibility. African nations were reclaiming their place in the world, inheriting a legacy of complexity, innovation, and resilience. The stories of Egypt, Mali, and Benin were not relics. They were a living foundation for the continent's next chapter. The 20th century marked Africa's reintroduction to the world. No longer hidden behind colonial narratives, African nations began to assert themselves on the global stage. But this return was complex. It required strategy, vision, and a bold reclaiming of centuries of influence. Diplomacy became a key battleground. Visionary leaders like Kwame Nkrumah and Julius Nyerere knew Africa's voice had to be heard, not as a plea, but as a demand for equality. They used platforms like the United Nations and the Organization of African Unity to challenge neocolonialism and advocate for economic justice. Africa's long history of empire and trade gave its diplomats a unique strategic edge. They understood negotiation and alliance building in ways the world often underestimated. Economic strategy also reflected this historical intelligence. Nations worked to control their natural resources and develop local industries. Ghana's cocoa, Nigeria's oil, these weren't just commodities, they were instruments of influence. Leaders drew lessons from pre-colonial empires. Wealth is only power when it's managed strategically. This historical blueprint helped them balance internal development with global engagement. But perhaps the most powerful tool was cultural diplomacy. African music, art, and literature crossed oceans, shattering old stereotypes and reshaping global perceptions. From Fela Kuti's revolutionary Afrobeat to Chinua Achebe's groundbreaking novels, the continent reminded the world that it had always been a source of innovation. These cultural exports were more than just entertainment. They were powerful assertions of intellectual and cultural sovereignty. Africa wasn't just rejoining the world, it was reminding the world of the creativity and resilience it had always possessed. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey through Africa's modern history inspiring, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more stories that challenge the narrative. Exports were not entertainment alone. They were assertions of identity, memory, and intellectual authority. Education continued to be transformative. African universities became incubators of leadership, scholarship, and innovation. Curricula integrated local knowledge with global insights, producing generations capable of navigating both African traditions and international systems. Science, medicine, and technology benefited from centuries of indigenous knowledge, adapted to modern challenges. From agriculture to engineering, African expertise became increasingly visible on the global stage. At the same time, Africa faced persistent challenges. Borders drawn by colonial powers often encompass diverse ethnic and cultural groups, creating internal friction. Economies dependent on a single export commodity were vulnerable to global market fluctuations. Global politics, including Cold War dynamics, imposed pressures that required strategic adaptation. African leaders had to combine historical wisdom with modern statecraft, a balancing act reminiscent of the governance strategies of Mali, Benin, and Oyo centuries earlier. Yet Africa also demonstrated remarkable ingenuity. Pan-Africanism became both ideology and movement, connecting African nations with diaspora communities worldwide. Shared history, culture, and struggle became a source of unity and strength. Africans across continents collaborated in trade, diplomacy, and intellectual exchange, echoing the transcontinental networks that existed long before colonial intervention. Technology and innovation accelerated Africa's global impact. Satellite communications, transportation infrastructure, and digital networks allowed African voices to participate in global debates in real time. African inventors, scientists, and entrepreneurs began contributing to fields from medicine to information technology, blending indigenous knowledge with contemporary techniques. The legacy of centuries of adaptation and problem-solving became apparent. Africa innovated not only out of necessity but out of mastery. The continent also asserted moral leadership. African nations played critical roles in decolonization, human rights advocacy, and environmental stewardship. Africa's experience with survival under extreme adversity allowed its leaders to articulate perspectives that were both historically informed and strategically forward-looking. Lessons learned from centuries of empire, trade, and resistance became frameworks for negotiation, alliance, and advocacy in the international arena. Culture, diplomacy, and governance intertwined. African nations demonstrated that identity is power, memory is strategy, and resilience is influence. The continent's centuries-old empires had taught lessons of organization, adaptation, and endurance that now manifested in a modern, interconnected world. Africa was not emerging as a passive participant. It was asserting itself as a knowledge holder, innovator, and force of continuity. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Africa's presence on the global stage was undeniable. Economically, culturally, and diplomatically, the continent had reclaimed its voice. Its history of empires, resilience, and innovation informed every step, revealing a pattern that had endured for millennia. Africa had never been absent from history. It had always been shaping it, even when the world refused to recognize it. The 21st century dawned on Africa with a promise. Centuries of resilience, ingenuity, and adaptation were finally converging with global technology to create an unprecedented renaissance. This era was not defined by what Africa lacked, but by what it had accumulated over millennia: knowledge, creativity, problem-solving, and networks, and how these foundations were now amplified by digital innovation. Consider communication. For centuries, Africa had mastered the flow of information: drum signals across forests, messengers along rivers, and complex trade networks spanning deserts. Today, these ancient principles found new life in digital networks. Mobile phones and internet connectivity allowed entrepreneurs in Lagos, Accra, Nairobi, and Dakar to transmit knowledge, conduct business, and organize communities in ways reminiscent of the strategic coordination of pre-colonial empires. Patterns of information flow were old, but the tools were new and powerful. Fintech became a revolution rooted in African ingenuity. Mobile banking platforms like M-Pesa in Kenya and similar innovations across Nigeria and Ghana allowed millions to access financial systems without traditional banks. This was not merely technology. It was the modern equivalent of centuries-old trade and credit networks. Africans had historically understood the power of currency, credit, and trust. Today, that wisdom underpins systems that leapfrogged conventional models worldwide. Agriculture, too, experienced a renaissance. Indigenous knowledge, developed over thousands of years, informed new sustainable practices. Precision farming, climate-resilient crops, and data-driven irrigation systems merged with local expertise. Africa's ability to innovate in response to environmental challenges echoed the ingenuity of past empires, from irrigation management in Egypt to terraced agriculture in West Africa. Technology amplified what Africans had long done successfully. Entrepreneurship blossomed in urban centers. Markets once defined by physical trade now thrived online. E-commerce platforms allowed African businesses to reach global consumers. Creative industries, music, fashion, and art used digital platforms to export culture, identity, and influence worldwide. The ingenuity of centuries of trade, artistry, and cultural adaptation now found expression in apps, social media, and digital marketplaces. Education underwent transformation. Online learning, virtual classrooms, and access to global knowledge networks allowed African students and professionals to engage with the world while preserving local identity. Curricula integrated indigenous knowledge with modern science, ensuring that the lessons of history informed the innovations of the future. Africa's centuries-long tradition of scholarship and adaptation became a blueprint for the digital era. Health and medicine also benefited. African innovators applied data analytics, mobile platforms, and biotechnology to public health challenges. Lessons from traditional medicine, plants, herbal treatments, and preventative strategies merged with modern techniques, creating hybrid solutions uniquely suited to African contexts. Knowledge from centuries of adaptation became a tool for contemporary resilience. Urban planning and infrastructure embraced innovation while drawing on historical lessons. Cities learned from the organizational genius of empires like Benin, Ife, and Oyo. Zoning, transport, and utilities reflected both modern efficiency and respect for communal life. Africa's historical urban expertise informed contemporary smart city initiatives, blending culture, function, and sustainability. Cultural preservation went digital. Archives, oral histories, music, art, and languages were recorded, digitized, and shared globally. African memory, once hidden or erased, became accessible to millions worldwide, creating both pride and influence. Technology amplified the resilience that had always been Africa's greatest asset. The African diaspora became a key partner. Connectivity allowed collaboration across continents, creating networks of innovation in finance, health, technology, and culture. Africa's influence, carried by its people and amplified by digital tools, reached further than ever before. Centuries-old lessons in adaptation, trade, and strategy now had global resonance. This technological renaissance demonstrates a profound truth. Africa's modern success is inseparable from its history. The creativity, resilience, and problem-solving honed over thousands of years, through empires, trade, resistance, and adaptation, did not vanish under slavery or colonialism. Instead, it evolved. Today, digital tools, global markets, and connectivity allow Africa to reclaim its narrative, influence, and power on a scale unparalleled in history. In the next chapter, we will explore Africa's role in global culture, politics, and innovation in the 21st century, how the continent is shaping trends, ideas, and technologies worldwide while reconnecting with the deep legacies of its past. In the 21st century, Africa is no longer a passive observer of global trends. It is an active shaper. From culture to technology, diplomacy to commerce, the continent is asserting influence in ways that reflect millennia of innovation, resilience, and strategic thinking. What makes this era remarkable is how it fuses historical legacy with modern tools, creating a powerful, multidimensional presence on the global stage. Cultural influence is one of the most visible arenas. African music, fashion, literature, and film dominate global markets. Afrobeat, hip-hop, and contemporary African cinema are no longer niche. They are mainstream. Artists like Burna Boy, Wizkid, Angelique Kidjo, and Lupita Nyong'o carry narratives, history, and identity to global audiences. The continent's centuries-long tradition of storytelling, symbolism, and artistry finds new life in international culture, proving that influence is inseparable from memory. Literature has also asserted global significance. Writers like Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Teju Cole build upon African oral traditions, historical chronicles, and philosophical inquiry. Their works challenge global assumptions, share nuanced perspectives, and position Africa not as a backdrop, but as an intellectual force shaping modern thought. Storytelling, which sustained African empires and diaspora communities for centuries, now resonates globally in unprecedented ways. Economically, Africa is increasingly interconnected with global markets. Tech hubs in Lagos, Nairobi, Cape Town, and Accra are incubating startups that innovate in fintech, health, agriculture, and logistics. Platforms like Flutterwave, Andela, and Jumia leverage Africa's historical expertise in trade, logistics, and networks, blending ancient knowledge with modern technology. Africa's economic strategies, honed over millennia of empires and commerce, now scale globally. Diplomacy reflects Africa's strategic heritage. Continental organizations like the African Union advocate for collective security, trade, and political influence, while individual nations engage globally to protect sovereignty, promote development, and influence international policies. Africa's leaders draw upon centuries of governance, negotiation, and alliance building, demonstrating that diplomacy is both a historical and modern strength. Science and innovation continue to grow exponentially. African researchers contribute to medicine, environmental science, engineering, and information technology. Innovations like renewable energy solutions in Kenya, mobile health platforms across West Africa, and AI research in Nigeria are transforming local communities while influencing global practices. Knowledge, preserved for centuries through oral traditions, apprenticeships, and scholarship, now converges with modern methodologies to drive tangible change. Education remains a cornerstone of influence. African universities are partnering with global institutions to produce graduates who are culturally grounded, technologically literate, and globally connected. Curricula increasingly integrate indigenous knowledge with modern innovation, demonstrating that Africa's historical genius is foundational for contemporary progress. This educational renaissance positions Africa as a contributor to solving global challenges. The African diaspora amplifies influence worldwide. Across North America, Europe, Latin America, and the Caribbean, Africans and their descendants drive culture, business, politics, and science. Diaspora communities leverage technology and social networks to connect with the continent, creating flows of capital, knowledge, and cultural exchange. Africa's historical resilience informs these modern networks, allowing influence to expand far beyond borders. Africa's role in environmental and social innovation is also profound. From combating desertification in the Sahel to preserving biodiversity in the Congo Basin, Africans apply traditional ecological knowledge and modern science collaboratively. Community-driven solutions, rooted in centuries of environmental understanding, are increasingly studied and replicated globally. Politically, African nations influence global governance through advocacy, peacekeeping, and international negotiations. Historical experience with diplomacy, resistance, and alliance building underpins modern strategies. Africa engages on issues like climate change, trade equity, human rights, and global security, not as a peripheral actor, but as a central and strategic participant. Ultimately, Africa's 21st century influence is inseparable from its history. The resilience of empires, the sophistication of trade networks, the depth of scholarship, and the continuity of culture all converge in modern achievements. Africa shapes not only its own destiny but also the trajectory of the global community. What was once hidden, underestimated, or erased is now visible, undeniable, and transformative. Africa's story is not only one of triumph, it is also one of tension. The continent carries the weight of millennia. Empires that once thrived, the devastation of slavery, the extraction of colonialism, and the complex challenges of modern nationhood. Yet within these layers of history lies a source of unparalleled strength: the ability to reconcile memory with innovation, trauma with creativity, and tradition with modernity. The first step in this reconciliation is historical awareness. Across Nigeria, Ghana, Egypt, and other regions, historians, educators, and community leaders emphasize the importance of understanding pre-colonial empires. Knowledge of Mali's wealth, Benin's artistry, Oyo's governance, and Egypt's monumental achievements empowers modern Africans to see themselves as inheritors of profound intellectual and cultural legacies. Memory is no longer passive. It becomes a roadmap for future development. Education plays a transformative role in reconciling past and future. Schools and universities integrate African history with global knowledge, teaching students not only mathematics, science, and literature but also the lessons embedded in centuries of African innovation. Young people learn that resilience is not abstract. It is encoded in governance, trade networks, cultural practices, and environmental management. By grounding innovation in historical awareness, Africa prepares a generation capable of navigating modern challenges while rooted in identity. Cultural revival is another pillar of reconciliation. Music, dance, art, and storytelling connect contemporary Africans to their ancestors, providing both inspiration and continuity. Festivals celebrate historical achievements, honor ancestral wisdom, and transmit moral and practical lessons. Cultural memory becomes both a lens and a lens to understand where the continent has been, and a tool to navigate where it must go. Economically, Africa reconciles history and future by learning from both pre-colonial trade networks and modern global markets. Entrepreneurs draw lessons from the sophisticated commerce of empires like Ghana, Mali, and the Hausa city-states, applying principles of diversification, resilience, and strategic alliances. At the same time, digital tools, fintech solutions, and global supply chains enable Africa to compete on a world stage while preserving local knowledge and autonomy. Politics is equally influenced by history. Nation building requires balancing diverse ethnicities, languages, and traditions, an echo of pre-colonial federations and councils. African leaders increasingly look to historical models of governance, consensus building, and dispute resolution to guide modern decision-making. The challenge lies in reconciling imposed borders with ancestral memory, and the successes lie in systems that respect both. Technology and innovation provide new means of reconciliation. African scientists, engineers, and tech entrepreneurs integrate centuries of knowledge with modern solutions, from agricultural biotechnology informed by indigenous methods to renewable energy projects inspired by local environmental understanding. Innovation is not a replacement of tradition. It is an extension of it, amplified by global connectivity. Socially, reconciliation requires healing from the traumas of slavery and colonialism. Programs in education, public health, and community development address both material and cultural legacies. Oral histories and storytelling preserve memory while providing psychological and social cohesion. Communities reclaim identity by connecting contemporary life to ancestral resilience, demonstrating that survival is both historical and ongoing. The diaspora plays a critical role in this process. Africans abroad maintain links to their heritage, collaborate on projects in Africa, and amplify cultural and economic influence worldwide. Transatlantic memory, once fragmented by displacement, becomes a bridge, linking past, present, and future. The diaspora helps reconcile historical rupture with modern integration, showing that Africa's influence is global, resilient, and multidimensional. Finally, reconciliation is about vision. Africans recognize that the continent's challenges, poverty, climate change, inequality, cannot be solved by ignoring history. Solutions must be informed by memory, culture, and centuries of adaptive ingenuity. By honoring past achievements while embracing modern tools, Africa creates a future that is both authentic and innovative. Africa's influence in the 21st century is not only political or economic, it is profoundly cultural. After centuries of suppression, erasure, and appropriation, the continent has reclaimed its voice through literature, music, visual arts, fashion, and cinema. This renaissance is both a continuation of historical creativity and a redefinition of Africa's place in the global imagination. Music has become one of Africa's most visible exports. Afrobeat, Afropop, high life, and traditional rhythms blend centuries-old patterns with contemporary production, creating sounds that dominate global charts. Artists like Burna Boy, Wizkid, Tiwa Savage, and Angelique Kidjo carry forward the storytelling tradition that once chronicled empires, battles, and daily life. Music now serves as both entertainment and a medium for education, social commentary, and cultural pride. Literature reflects the same continuity. African writers draw on pre-colonial histories, oral traditions, and diaspora experiences to craft narratives that resonate globally. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Wole Soyinka explore identity, resilience, and historical memory. Their works are bridges connecting past and present, showing that African literature is rooted in centuries of intellectual and artistic innovation. Cinema and visual storytelling have expanded Africa's reach. Nollywood, now one of the largest film industries in the world, creates stories that reflect local realities while attracting international audiences. Films are both mirrors of contemporary life and repositories of memory, exploring themes of heritage, colonization, resilience, and aspiration. African cinema demonstrates that storytelling is a living, evolving force, carrying forward centuries of narrative ingenuity. Fashion and design reclaim traditional aesthetics while innovating globally. African textiles, patterns, and couture are featured on international runways, merging ancestral techniques with modern creativity. Designers draw inspiration from centuries of artistry, Benin bronzes, Kente cloth, Yoruba beadwork, creating contemporary statements that honor heritage while influencing global trends. Fashion becomes a statement of identity, pride, and historical continuity. Art, too, is thriving. Contemporary African painters, sculptors, and digital artists reinterpret motifs from Nok, Ife, and Benin. They merge ancient techniques with new media, exploring themes of memory, identity, and modernity. Exhibitions in Europe, North America, and Asia feature African art not as a curiosity, but as a sophisticated, innovative, and globally relevant form of expression. Education and scholarship support this renaissance. African universities and cultural institutions document, archive, and research history, art, and literature, creating knowledge that informs creativity worldwide. Scholars trace lineage, influence, and innovation, ensuring that cultural production is grounded in historical awareness while also inspiring new directions. The diaspora amplifies the Renaissance. Africans abroad produce music, literature, and art that draws on continental heritage, blending it with local contexts to reach global audiences. From Afrobeat festivals in London to literary conferences in New York, African culture is both celebrated and influential. This transcontinental exchange mirrors ancient trade and scholarly networks, now operating in the digital and creative realms. Technology has accelerated this cultural resurgence. Social media, streaming platforms, and digital marketplaces allow African creatives to bypass traditional gatekeepers, reaching audiences directly. This democratization ensures that Africa's cultural output is visible, influential, and self-determined. Digital tools allow art to travel across borders instantly, making Africa a global cultural hub in real time. Importantly, this cultural renaissance is more than entertainment. It is a reclamation of identity and history. By producing, curating, and sharing art rooted in African knowledge and memory, the continent asserts its narrative authority. Africa is no longer a passive subject of stories. It is the storyteller, shaping how the world perceives its history, complexity, and creativity. Africa's story is neither simple nor linear. From the majestic Nile civilizations to the complex empires of Mali, Ghana, Benin, and Oyo, the continent has continuously shaped human history through innovation, resilience, and creativity. Even under the darkest periods of slavery, colonialism, and exploitation, Africa preserved its memory, knowledge, and identity. Today, the continent is reclaiming its narrative, asserting its influence, and inspiring the world once more. Throughout millennia, Africans built empires with sophisticated governance, commerce, and education systems. They mastered agriculture, mathematics, architecture, and medicine long before European contact. These accomplishments formed the foundation for civilizations that thrived across West, East, and North Africa. They left legacies that survived destruction, displacement, and cultural erasure, proof that Africa's genius was not contingent on recognition but on persistent knowledge, adaptation, and vision. The transatlantic slave trade and colonialism sought to dismantle African society, yet the continent's influence persisted. Enslaved Africans carried knowledge, culture, and traditions across oceans. Diaspora communities in the Americas, Europe, and the Caribbean preserved languages, music, spirituality, and governance principles that reshaped the world. Africa's legacy, even when hidden, continued to ripple across continents. Independence movements of the 20th century were more than political milestones. They were a reclamation of history, identity, and self-determination. Leaders drew on centuries of governance, diplomacy, and strategy to build nations amidst immense challenges. Education, trade, and cultural revival provided tools to navigate modernity while remaining rooted in tradition. Africa's ability to adapt, innovate, and preserve knowledge proved once again that resilience is a hallmark of the continent. In the modern era, Africa's influence is visible across every domain. Culturally, music, literature, art, and cinema dominate global conversations. Economically, technological innovation, from fintech to agriculture, is redefining markets and development. Politically, African nations contribute to global governance, diplomacy, and conflict resolution. Environmentally, the continent leads in climate resilience and ecological stewardship, applying centuries of local knowledge to global problems. What unites these achievements is continuity. Africa's present is inseparable from its past. Every innovation, every cultural export, every act of resistance or creativity echoes strategies honed over millennia. From ancient empires to modern metropolises, the continent demonstrates that history is not static. It is living, evolving, and shaping the future. Africa's story also offers a global lesson. Resilience, knowledge, and creativity cannot be erased. Systems, culture, and identity endure when nurtured, preserved, and adapted. Even in the face of oppression or erasure, Africa's influence persisted, quietly shaping global systems, ideas, and innovations. This is the continent's most enduring legacy, the power to survive, adapt, and transform, not only for itself but for the entire world. As the 21st century unfolds, Africa continues to rise. Its cities hum with innovation, its scholars expand knowledge, its artists redefine culture, and its leaders navigate a complex global stage. The continent that once birthed pyramids, great empires, and trade networks now births technologies, global art, and political influence, continuing the story of ingenuity and resilience that began thousands of years ago. Ultimately, Africa's history is a testament to human potential. It shows that brilliance cannot be erased, that knowledge survives even under extreme pressure, and that identity and memory are sources of unmatched power. From Egypt's monumental legacies to Nigeria's complex societies, from Ghana's trade empires to modern technological hubs, Africa has shaped the world, and it will continue to do so. This is not just history, it is living legacy. Africa's past, present, and future are inseparable, woven together by innovation, resilience, and creativity. And as the world moves forward, it does so on foundations laid by the continent that has always been, and will always remain, a center of civilization, influence, and inspiration. The story of Africa is not finished. It is ongoing, dynamic, and shaping the world, one generation at a time.